My name is Jacqueline Mattis. I'm the chair of the Department of Applied Psychology in Steinhardt, and my research focuses on the role of religion and spirituality in the lives of African Americans. And I'm particularly interested in the role that religion and spirituality play in positive development for African Americans. So I'm interested in outcomes like volunteerism, altruism, optimism, things that sort of suggest that people are doing and living well. The way that my work sort of got started was growing up in African American and Caribbean communities. The thing that always struck me was it's amazing, regardless of what people go through, they ultimately end up feeling like the world is really going to be okay. And when we think about optimism, the way we usually define optimism is relative to pessimism. So we have this metaphor of the glass being half empty versus half full. And the optimist presumably looks at a glass that has water or something halfway up and says, oh, the glass is half full. A dispositional optimist, which is what I'm interested in, is someone who, regardless of what life truly brings to them, the challenges, no matter what life brings, they ultimately believe that things are going to work out okay. So whereas, again, the optimist will in a moment say the glass is half full, a dispositional optimist will say, I know the glass can be shattered, I know it probably is shattered, but I'm awestruck by the fact that it continues to hold water. The distinction between religiosity and spirituality in my work, I've asked African American men and women to talk a little bit about if they think of themselves as religious, what does that mean? If they think of themselves as spiritual, what does that mean? And are there overlaps? And it turns out that there was one woman I interviewed who I think really sort of captured it. And she said, religion is what you do when you're afraid of going to hell. Spirituality is what you do when you've already been there. And for me, that captures the sense that there's something that happens when life really pushes you to your final limits that makes you develop a personal sense of what's sacred, what's important. If you're religious and spiritual, the spiritual part is the part that makes you develop a relationship with a God who is bigger than you in a way that no one can define for you. It's just you and that one being. And so for me, the notion of spirituality is as important as the notion of religion. I have a 9-year-old boy who I had interviewed who spends much of his life giving to his mom and his little sisters, and his entire life is organized around that. And if you talk to him, his real sense is that God has given so much to him, and this is a kid who comes from a really poor family, and he really does believe that he has so much richness because he has a mom who laughs, he has a sister who adores him, who's 7 years old, and for him, that's what gift looks like, and that's what grace looks like. So for him, he's a spiritual person, and his sense of optimism is really profound, and the same thing goes for adults who I've interviewed. There is that sense that if one has a personal relationship, that you really sort of live in the world in a way that suggests that everything will be okay. It's not clear whether you can make people more optimistic or whether you can make people more altruistic. I'm going to bet that we can. And so when I think about, again, the work that I've done, one of the things that made me start studying altruism was watching a 16-year-old boy engage in a tremendous act of altruism. So he was working 2 jobs so that he could buy a bike, so that he could get a job as a bike messenger to help his mom. He saw a kid down the hallway from him, and he's a kid who lives in a housing project in New York City. He takes the money that he'd been working to use to buy his bike, and he decides to use this money to buy a coat for a child he does not know, has no relationship to. And he drops the coat off, comes back, and someone saw him running away from the door where he left the coat. And when we talked to him about what led him to do what he did, his perspective was that that's just what you do, and he didn't want to talk about it anymore. He gives me hope that we can teach people how to live and live well. And he gives me hope specifically because he's a kid who grew up in a context where he doesn't see a lot of images of people giving in that profound a way. There's nothing that should have made him live that way. And he's a kid who, if you saw him on the street, he's in a gang. He has to be because it's the only way to keep himself alive and to keep his family alive. But he's made some decisions about how he's going to live in the world despite the realities of what he's being forced to do. And this is a good kid. If we can find a way of figuring out how to channel the optimism that led him to believe that it would be a good thing and there would be positive outcomes from giving to a child he doesn't know, if we can find out what led him to develop a character that nothing in his environment sustains, then I think we can figure out how to make this a much more entrenched, institutionalized way of thinking. And it's the danger is in thinking of low-income communities as communities where there isn't much of that giving, but the reality is in wealthy communities there's not much of that giving either. And so if we can figure out how to make this kid and his character applicable to the wealthy kids and the wealthy adults who don't give either, then we can do something really profound. So I want to have him be the role model for a whole lot of people he probably will never meet.